Have you ever noticed how conversations and body language shift in the classroom when students receive feedback rather than a grade? In this episode of Any Voices, I sit down with Darla, a reflective math and science teacher at MUCC, who is transforming the way we think about assessment. Darla shares her journey of moving away from traditional grading and focusing on the potential of feedback to empower students. We dive into the difference between formative and summative assessments, how feedback impacts student learning, and the challenges of breaking free from the grade addict mindset. Darla also shares actionable insights from her classroom, including innovative ways to engage students in meaningful self-reflection and planning. Join us on today's episode as we explore Darla's strategies, the research that influenced her shift in thinking, and the surprising results that she's seen by emphasizing feedback over marks. Let's join the conversation. Welcome to Northeast Voices, a podcast that spotlights the innovators and change makers in education. We're here to share the stories of inclusion, empowerment, and the impactful connections with the Northeast School Division and beyond, focusing on the pivotal role of students, families, and teachers. Join us as we dive into the conversations revealing the strategies and moments shaping the future of education. Any Voices is your platform for inspiration and connection, and is recorded in the Northeast School Division, sharing the land of Treaties 4, 5, 6, and homeland of the Métis in Northeast Saskatchewan. Be sure to subscribe and join our community of innovators and change makers. Let's get started. So welcome back to our next episode of Northeast Voices, or Any Voices, where we look to amplify the voices of educators within the Northeast. Today, I'm here with Darla. She's a teacher at MUCC. And Darla and I met years ago when she was actually interning at TMSS. I remember a drive. It was a long drive, I think 3.5 hours down to Regina for a cymatics conference. So if you're listening to this out there and you're a science or a math teacher, you probably remember those cymatics conferences. I'm really excited to be here with Darla today. We've been following her story for a while now, and she is exploring what it's like to work with students and really dig into formative assessment without any marks attached to that. So we'll dig in today to what that looks like in a grade book, what kind of conversations does she engage in with students for that, and what are some of the results that she's seen. So drop a comment down below, let us know where you're joining from, and if you have any questions for either of us during the podcast, don't hesitate to email us and we'll be in touch. So welcome, Darla. I'm excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on.
Yes, and we're just getting it started, and Darla has graciously volunteered to be my guest. So, if anybody who's listening out there, any of our Any Voices listeners, if you have again any questions or wonders, don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to get your questions so we could come back on a future episode and dig into those questions a little bit more. First of all, let's get to know Darla a little bit. So, I mentioned she teaches at MUCC, but tell us a little bit just about what you teach right now, and then we'll go into the story of how you got here in just a moment.
Sure. So I'm a teacher at MUCC and I currently teach grade 9 to 12, both math and science, science 10s and physical science in there, chemistry, pre-calc, math 9, a little mix of everything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good variety of math and science. So lots of different
it is.
opportunity to integrate in your work. And so I gave a little bit of a hint in the introduction, some of the things that you're working on and experimenting with. And we'll get into the story of what sort of led you down the path to this work with assessment. So my daughter, for example, is in your grade 9 math class. And I know you're probably trying this out in a variety of classes. But when we talk
Yeah.
about formative assessment and working with students in a math class, can you give us a brief overview of what it is you're doing?
Yeah. So my goal in my math classes, but in all of my classes, has been to reduce the number of grades that are given and increase the amount of feedback. So, just through a lot of the research that I've done, feedback is really the driving force in student learning. And so, I've over a number of years, I've been trying to figure out how do we incorporate more feedback, more student voice, and more focus on learning versus collecting grades or being focused on the label that's given at the end of learning.
Well said. So often we go to what that mark is, and sometimes when we focus just on the mark,
we tend to ignore all of the feedback that would actually help propel us forward. So I
Yes.
really appreciate that you're looking to increase student voice to get them thinking about what they're learning. Are they making progress? How are they setting a goal to move forward? What do you do if you don't understand? So that's what we're going to dig into in just a little bit. But I think it's important for our listeners to hear, how did you get to this point? And I know Darla's presenting at IT Summit and sharing a bit of her story and some of the work that she's doing at the provincial conference. So if we go back to when you had finished your internship and you get a job, how did you sort of, what led you down this path of exploring how we can really dig into student voice and decrease the amount of letter or number grades that we're putting in and really increase that feedback that's going to propel learning?
So I think it really started when I was in my last year of education. And I remember one of my profs said, like, did you know that there's research out there about grades and feedback? And that actually feedback is the thing that is propelling the learning forward. It's really not the grades. And I was like, hold up. Like, I don't think that's true. Um, I have to admit, I think I'm probably a recovering grade addict. Like, if somebody asked me from when I was in high school, I was all about trying to figure out how I could get the highest mark possible. And so I wasn't really convinced, but it really stopped me in my tracks because I was like, I'm not sure about that. And as I went into my internship and when I'm getting my first job here, I guess I interned in the NESD in Tisdale, and
Yes.
now I work here in Melfort, and so I came in right as we were transitioning into this world of rubrics, and we were talking about formative and summative assessment, and I came in a very interesting time in education, and it really forced me to stop and think about what assessment was, like, what was the purpose of it, and that maybe what we've been doing all this time really isn't doing what we think it's doing. And so as I learned more about formative assessment and the purpose of formative assessment and maybe the difference between formative and summative assessment, I really started to think about, okay, I've got to figure out some way to reduce our focus on marks and to increase our focus on learning. And so initially, my thought was, okay, I'm just going to jump in and I'm going to start giving more feedback. When I think I should give a grade, I'm going to give feedback instead. And so I started doing that kind of in little pieces, but I realized that I was missing something. That sometimes, yes, the students were getting their feedback, they were reading it. That was all wonderful, but sometimes we were just missing that next step. And so I was trying to figure out, how can I get my students to utilize this feedback? And that was the key. They needed to be able to, I needed to give them an opportunity to read the feedback and make a plan for next steps. And so that's when I had learned in my internship about this tool called a progress chart. And so I decided that I wanted to kind of alter what we had done with this progress chart to try to give the students the opportunity to act on this feedback. And so it's eventually evolved into this whole notebook system, and that's kind of for another day. But essentially, it just gives them a place to keep track of their feedback. What are they doing well? What do they need to work on? And then the most important part, what are they going to do? What is their learning plan or their action plan moving forward?
You summarized that really, really well. I love the phrase, how did you put it? A recovering grade addict. I can certainly
Yeah.
relate to that. And I'm sure lots of teachers out there can relate to, what's my grade and where am I at and how am I going to get a better mark? I'm not sure
Yeah.
when I went through school if I truly understood the concepts or I was really good at doing what was asked for that specific piece. And I think what you're pushing students, or not pushing, but encouraging them to explore is, think about what the feedback is. How am I actually going to use that, leverage the feedback to get better? Because it's really not about the grade. It's about what you can do with what you're learning. Do you understand that concept and can you use it to move ahead? So I appreciate that you said they shared the research, and we can talk about the Dylan William research, and maybe now is a good time to do that. But that research sometimes is a way to give us pause and to get us to reflect on our practice. And so in the Northeast School Division, teachers are all part of the innovation sprints where we take a look at some of the research and we set goals and we try different strategies in the classroom and we reflect on how that's going. And so you're putting those pieces into action, and we huddle weekly with colleagues so we get to have those conversations because we know that collaboration is really important to help us see the progress that we're making. So let's take a minute and just pause and talk about the research. And I know Dylan William is one of the people that has fairly specific research on the effectiveness of feedback. Did you want to share a little bit more about the difference between giving a mark, giving just feedback, or mark and feedback?
Yeah, and actually I looked back at this earlier today, but like all the way back in 1988, which is when I was born. So this is kind of crazy to think that this idea has been out here for so long, but when we're thinking about we could have give just feedback, we could give a mark and feedback, or we could just give them a mark. And I think most people might suggest that giving both the mark and the feedback would be the most effective.
Pause right there. Just I'm going to jump in because for anyone out there that's listening, so Darla just gave us three options, and I just want people to pause for a moment and think about which one they think will have the most impact on students. And so you mentioned just a mark as one option,
Yeah,
you mentioned just feedback, and then you mentioned a mark with feedback. So as you're
correct.
listening out there, maybe you're driving home in the car, maybe you're cleaning your house while you're listening to this. See which one of those options do you think is going to have the most impact on students? Mark by itself, feedback by itself, or a combination of mark and feedback. So let's jump back into what you were going to say, Darla. I think most people probably would go for which one?
Yeah, I think most people would assume that the mark along with the feedback is going to be the most effective. And in reality, or based on the research and what I've seen in front of me in my classroom, is that as soon as there's a mark attached to it, that feedback goes out the window. All we can focus on is that score or that letter that was attached to the assessment. And so the feedback just kind of goes out the window and it stops learning right there. So whether you got 100% or you got 50% on that assessment, the students who maybe got 100% is like, all right, I've got this case. I don't need to do any more learning. I've got it. The student that got 50% might be like, oh man, like I don't get this. I'm going to throw in the towel. And so if we can tailor our feedback so that the feedback is addressing the strengths of our students where they're at, and we can suggest options to move learning forward for every single student in our classroom, that is the power of the feedback.
And I appreciate what you said there. Sometimes we use the mark as a label to reinforce the story we tell about ourselves. So if I did well,
Absolutely.
I don't need your feedback. I had it all figured out. Perhaps is maybe
Yeah.
what some students say,
Maybe.
or
Yes.
they're
Yeah.
relieved that I did get it right. I
Yes.
don't know why
Yeah.
I got it right, but that I did. And there are certainly students that have
Right.
a very deep understanding. On
Of
the flip
course.
side, right? And on the flip side, if I'm struggling or I got a 50 and I don't know, does that mark just reinforce that I'm not a math student? And I think we hear that in all subjects like I'm not a reader or I'm not, I don't, math is not my thing. Maybe it's not my thing
Mhm.
yet. Maybe I just haven't made the
Yes.
connection to what I'm learning to see how it goes. I really appreciate that you mentioned the strengths, that the feedback that we give we want to build on the strength, identify where we need to do some work, and then what is that next step to move forward. And I think you said with that, so let's just pause for the viewers here. So a grade by itself doesn't actually make learning go forward. Knowing that you got 30, 40, 50, 100, or an EU plus or an FM doesn't necessarily have the impact on learning that we perhaps previously thought. And I like that you mentioned that it was 1988 when the research started to come out about this. And what you've just said, and I like how you referenced that you're seeing this in the students in front of you. It's not just what we read in a book, although what we read in the book from Dylan Williams is well researched. But Dylan
Yes.
Williams talks about as soon as you put that grade with the feedback, which is probably where a lot of us thought we would have the most impact, is that I can
Yeah.
give you a score on the rubric and the feedback. But as soon as there's that score, just like you said, students, we all tune out whatever the feedback is. So actually, when it's
Absolutely.
only feedback, I believe Dylan Williams says it not only accelerates the learning, so you can get more done in a shorter period of time, it's actually more effective in that they know what they need to do and they use that to propel it forward and they leave the mark behind. So,
Yes. Yeah. It's crazy. Like if I compare I if I return an assessment that's just got feedback on it, like an exit card or something like that, the students immediately they're reading their feedback as they're walking back to their desk, figuring out, okay, like how did this go? And they're going to fill in their progress charts. They know exactly what they're supposed to do. But on the flip side, if I was to give back some sort of summative assessment that does have a mark attached to it at the end, immediately the conversation in the room is, "Oh, how did you do on that?" Or "Which question did you get wrong?" Or how did you like, the conversation is immediately flipped, and either students are very excited, which is good. We always want to celebrate their success. Some students immediately want to hide, but when we don't have just a number that we can throw out there, it's not as easy to compare the students. It's We're having different conversations about learning when there's feedback. It's Yeah. I wish I could videotape it so that you could see what it looks like.
what I think just exactly what you've described is you can hear it and you can see it in the
Yeah.
classroom. You can see it in how they're interacting with each other. You can tell, I can envision them, they're looking at their feedback on their way back to their desk. The other
Mhm.
important pieces that you've mentioned in there is you've created a routine. So the students know when it's time for formative feedback, when it's time to dig into that work, and when it's time for a summative piece. And so let's just do a really quick aside into formative and summative. So, how do you describe the difference between formative and summative to students in your class?
So in my class, they described formative assessment as being for informational purposes. And that formative assessment, our goal is always to use that information to learn something, to move forward. And summative assessment is at the end of our learning when we'd like to summarize what it is that we've learned and what we can celebrate, what we can do.
And so, where would you spend most of the time on assessments in your classroom? Is it more on formative or more on summative, or is it a pretty equal split?
Oh, by far, formative assessment. By far. Our focus is on formative assessment. It's just not until the very end when we'll do that snapshot of summative, doing a summative assessment.
And I think that's exactly what Dylan Williams was suggesting with the research that he shared. The more time we spend in kind of that idea of coaching, and I think it was Damian Cooper, and you can help me remember this example, but I believe he described a figure skater. And if a figure skater goes to a competition, and we think about who decides who wins the competition, and so there's judges at a competition, so they would give a score, and that would determine who gets on the podium. But if I wanted to do well at that event as a figure skater, it's not that I see a it's not a figure skating judge that I work with every day. And
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
I work with a coach,
Mhm.
just like in any sport, you spend a lot of time with your coach, and the coach doesn't give you a number or a letter. The
No.
coach gives
No.
you really specific feedback, right? And they
Yes.
spend a lot of time, you practice and you get the feedback and then you take that feedback and you practice again and you keep leveling up with that. So you spend an immense amount of time with your coach getting that feedback that's going to help you learn how to do that. And so I found that a helpful analogy just to think of it. Your coach is like the formative part, formative assessment in a class. That feedback, that reflection, the conversation, the learning that you do, that practice all helps you build your understanding and your skill level. So when it's time to demonstrate. And a summative piece is that snapshot in time where we do sort of a check, not permanent. It's not a permanent check, right? There's
Nope.
always opportunities to redemonstrate. But when the figure skater goes in front of the judge, that's for a purpose. It's very clear that's what the purpose is. And we're not expecting a lot of feedback from those judges about what's done. So that summative, just like you said, is a small portion of it. It's a checkpoint in time. And then we go either onto another concept or we use that to take some of that information forward and keep learning. So anything that you want to add to formative or summative before we go back to what it looks like in your classroom?
I think just in the world that I live in a math and science world, we have a very strong tendency. We love numbers in that world. And so we have a very strong tendency to put numbers on things that might actually be a formative assessment. And so I really would encourage anyone who's thinking about formative assessment to maybe just try putting feedback on that quiz instead of putting a mark. And I think you would be surprised at the difference that it makes. So just sometimes we just need to rethink what we think is summative as actually being a formative opportunity.
And I think earlier, I'm smiling because I was thinking back to when you said your introduction that you started by thinking, when I'd like to put a number, you said you paused and you thought, would a number make this better or would feedback make this better? And feedback, we work with EDSP in our school division. So feedback could be written feedback on a piece of paper. It could be digitally typed up inside of EDSP because a student has submitted evidence. It could be in a notebook. It could be audio. It could be video. It could be a photo annotated. It could be a conversation with a student. There's many,
Absolutely.
many different ways to give feedback. And I think that's a whole other podcast episode. But
Yeah.
what I liked what you said in and I'm a science teacher as well. We do like numbers and we like things to work out in sort of a linear fashion, but learning isn't a to Z where we start here and we get straight line there. Learning is circling back and it's a little messy at times, but digging into the challenges and looking at what's working and what's not working. And the feedback is going to help me step through that piece. So I liked how you said, what if I just paused and thought, would feedback help the student move forward just that little bit better? So I think that's a small habit shift that we could use for any of ourselves before we're giving a mark. What would actually work better for our students with that? Now,
Thank you to Darla for sharing her ongoing assessment journey with us and the difference it makes when we begin to shift our focus from grades to meaningful feedback and the value of formative feedback when it's used to both inform the students and the teacher's next steps. Never underestimate the importance of empowering students to take ownership in their learning by engaging them in actively thinking about where they are in their learning journey, what's next, and how they will get there. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you do, please consider sharing it with a fellow educator and remember to follow us on your favorite podcast platforms so you always know when the next episode is ready. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Remember, this is a 3-part series, so be sure to join us for part 2 of our assessment conversation coming up next. Thanks for listening. Thank you for joining our community of innovators and change makers. We hope the conversations and stories have ignited a spark within. We'd like to express our gratitude to our dedicated Northeast educators. Until next time, remember to subscribe to Any Voices and join us on the next episode as we share the stories of learning shaping our future. Thanks for listening.